Hello and welcome, dear friends. Thank you so much for joining me on another episode of the Always So podcast, a production of Will Wood's Faith and Marriage. This is Dr. Mario Sacasa, and I pray that you're having an amazing day today. Okay, well, how often do men and women feel at odds with each other in relationships, dating, marriage, and parenting? And what if those differences were there by design, and ignoring them only would create more frustration? What if equality didn't equal sameness? I know that's a buzzword, and I know that's hard to admit in today's day and age, but I think we need to have conversations about this. And so joining me on the show to talk about how we can navigate these differences more effectively is Dr. Brett Salkeld, host of the Thinking Faith podcast. I've had Brett on the show on a couple occasions, and I absolutely love chatting with him. In today's episode, we discuss the importance of acknowledging the inherent differences between men and women, how that leads to deeper connection and intimacy, and how evolutionary psychology provides some context to these questions. I admit that I'm not an expert in evolutionary psychology, but I have been listening and reading a number of resources related to the topic, and I'm grateful for Brett and his invitation to have this conversation so I can begin fleshing out some of these thoughts. It is amazing to see how some of these thoughts are beginning to come out in the popular culture, and so we have discussions about that as well. Well, throughout this episode, we share insightful analogies and real-life examples, just illustrating how these principles can play out in everyday life. Well, if you are enjoying this podcast, please, I ask you to leave a rating or write a review on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. Every single one of those little comments or reviews absolutely helps the show get into hands of other listeners like yourself who are curious about how to find solutions that are rooted in psychology, in counseling, and in faith. Well, God bless you all. Let's get into this conversation with Dr. Brett Salkeld.
Good to be with you.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it. Yeah, likewise. It's really great.
So, this is an odd one for me. I was listening to a podcast called Modern Wisdom, which is fascinating, kind of I would say, cultural phenomena.
I'm a fan of the show. I've listened to Chris, is it Williamson, I believe his name is?
Chris Williamson.
I've listened to a number of his episodes and have really enjoyed the guests that he has on. Do you know his background?
Little bit.
Yeah.
It was like a party boy who was on like a reality show, like a Love Island or something.
That's it. Yep, that's it.
And it was empty.
It
was like a meaningless, despairing, kind of situation. So he started asking like real questions, and he's just got a gift for asking good questions and like honestly probing and thinking about things.
Yeah.
And what's been fascinating for me is that he's like totally inadvertently discovering things that, the Christian tradition has thought about and talked about for a long time from another angle. And to see, it's this sort of pushback against the culture in some way, right?
Yep.
That a lot of things that have been abandoned, maybe without much thought, actually had more value than you might have guessed.
Yeah.
And he's sort of discovering them in this very secular space.
Yes.
And that means like there's some fascinating insights, and also like some swings and misses.
Yeah. Like the episode, that you listened to specifically. Yeah, that one. Has some really good points and some other points that were just a little off, and tropes that I've heard being a therapist, and attending professional conferences and things. But to the point that you're making, I'm sorry to interrupt you. What I appreciate about him, and there are a couple other podcasters that are secular in nature that are trying to get to some of these questions, and really trying to say, like, what does science really teach us? How do we really get to a point where we can ask meaningful questions about our existence, about what happiness actually is, about what good behavior means, about what healthy relationships mean? And it's fascinating to be able to see and to say that there is a lot of great science that's out there that is pointing the way.
Right.
And that is deeply encouraging.
Yeah. And I kind of feel like the main branch, at least for the stuff that I've been watching, which is largely like relationships, because I stumbled across him because I saw an interview with a psychologist named Sadia Khan,
Okay.
who's a fascinating person. I mean, she's one of these people who speaks like full paragraphs without any ums or ahs. Like you ask her a question and she gives you this fully articulated paragraph. She sees her discipline with such clarity, and she's bold enough to say things that you're not kind of allowed to say. And anyways, we found this little clip of her. I have 2 teenage boys, and she had this clip, and I think it was sort of like, why do the nice guys finish last kind of thing. And when I saw it, I was like, someone needed to tell me that when I was 12.
Yes.
Like it was just so straightforward and clear, but like I think a lot of young men are really confused on this point for much of their lives, right? They're told on the one hand to be nice, and then the women don't seem interested in that. And then some of them try to be jerks.
Right.
And then that doesn't work either.
Right. Right. That's right. Well, it can work in some degree. I mean,
right.
You know,
in the short term,
it depends.
And it'll get you into a really unhealthy relationship with
Correct.
someone who's looking for something behind that sort of jerk facade, you know,
right.
That's going to set up a whole series of unhealthy expectations and patterns, right? So we're kind of set up to fail by this. And she actually gave, and I wish I could remember the great advice she gave, but I can't. But anyways, I called my sons. I was like, let's watch this, because like someone needed to tell me this when I was your age, right? So that's how I got into it. And so I would say the main scientific branch that has been at play in the episodes I've been listening to is evolutionary psychology. And I just find evolutionary psychology completely fascinating. And I think its interface with theology, which is my discipline, and with psychology and counseling, which is your discipline, is really interesting. It's one of the, for example, it's one of the only places today that you're allowed to talk about the real differences between men and women.
Yeah, from a exactly. Yeah, it is. Absolutely.
And that leads to a bunch of insights that you're not allowed to get any other way. Maybe the theological tradition has some there, but you're not really allowed to talk about that, at least in the kind of sphere where Chris Williamson has managed to get into.
Correct.
So anyways, that's kind of the background. And then I watched this episode, and I'll go into a little more detail in a second, but I watched this episode, or not.
Well, let me say, can I say
go ahead.
So let me interrupt you there for a second. So from my standpoint also, I will say I've been fascinated by, again, as a therapist, I have always tried to kind of hit the crossroads in terms of what our faith teaches about these questions, but then also what does the science teach? And I'm a marriage counselor, and so I've been studying kind of the science of marriage and relationships, and I've seen certainly, you know, growth and trends that have happened over the years from when I was in grad school, whatever, over 15 years ago, studying kind of attachment theory and its application to adults, looking at different theories and how they apply to relationships. But in the last, really since graduate school, last 10, 15 years, we've seen this explosion of these questions related to neuroscience and what does neurology actually teach us about the differences between men and women and behaviors. And those questions, are those things mappable in our brains? Which has then also led me to these questions also regarding evolutionary psychology and what is the function like what I appreciate about evolutionary psychology is that at least it says there's reasons why we behave these ways, that it's not just arbitrary. It's not just, you know, there it is. We just kind of emerged out of nothing, that there is genetic history as to why we behave the way that we do. And so I've been, I guess recently, it was on a Jordan Peterson podcast, one of kind of the leaders in this field is a guy named Dr. David Buss, and he has a book called The Evolution of Desire, Strategies of Mating. And so I've read parts of this, and he was also on Chris Williamson's podcast. I was listening to that in preparation for our conversation today. And there's others. Jeffrey Miller is another kind of key figure in this, who did a book with Tucker Max, which I know we can talk about Tucker Max here in a little bit, you know, and the book's called What Women Want, but still like there's truth in this. But then there's also been, you know, a whole host of neurologists, Leonard Sachs, Luann Brizendine, others who are escaping my name right now. They've been trying to say these things exist. Now, the danger, of course, when we start going in this direction of kind of what does neurology or evolution have to say about sex differences, is that it very quickly can fall right back into, well, these are the stereotypes. This is what it is. Let's step into that. And no, that's not the point of all this. But the point is to say that there is a reason, again, like I said, why we behave the way that we do. And if we're looking at our biology and looking at our ancestry and our history, then we can't just ignore those things.
Right.
And we also can't be, reductionistic about them either. And that's where our faith comes in.
Yes. So that's a great setup. So, I mean, the reductionistic bit, I got to figure out which direction I want to go here because I got two different things going. So I'll do them sequentially.
This is why I love talking to you, Brett. I mean, we're just never a shortage of things to discuss.
So the one is that I wrote you because I listened to this one episode of the podcast and I thought the guy's half right on about everything, but his basic framework for approaching means that even if his data is right, his interpretation is goofy.
Correct.
And it leads to all kinds of really weird things. And so my experience listening to it was like, he's the evolutionary psychologist, but I think I actually understand the problem better than he does. But I'm a total amateur here. So I was like, well, let me talk to an actual psychologist and like test run if I'm close on anything. And so that's what I sent you an email and said like, hey, let's have a chat about this. So that's one thing. And we can go into detail about what the question was that he was dealing with on the Modern Wisdom podcast and some of my thoughts on it. And I want to hear what you think about that. But another question, which is broader, and maybe it's a conversation for another time, is I read the Tucker Max, Jeffrey Miller book. Yeah. I've been reading a ton of this kind of stuff. I don't know if you've read Esther Perel.
A little bit. Yeah.
She's fascinating.
Yeah.
I don't agree with everything she says, but my goodness, she's a fascinating person. Jay Stringer. Have you encountered Jay Stringer?
No, he's new. I don't know him.
He's an evangelical counselor and therapist who works with people on pornography questions. I read his book called Unwanted, which is really interesting. I'll share a bit about it. But anyways, I'm reading all this stuff, and one of the things that is occurring to me is, especially like the stuff that highlights the differences between men and women in terms of evolutionary psychology, is my own experience of marriage was way harder than it needed to be. Because no one was ever willing to talk about those differences and how they shape the way we experience and interpret one another's needs, fears, desires, like whatever, right? And so because we were taught how to minimize any differences between male and female, we couldn't actually understand what the other person wanted or needed from us. Right. And it took way more work. And just, I mean, the one example that I already shared, right? Like, do girls want a nice guy or a jerk? Well, yes and no both. To both.
Exactly.
but understanding what that is. So there's this chapter in the Tucker Max, Jeffrey Miller book called The Tender Defender. And that it's just, and along with Saadia Khan, it was like, it finally helped me understand what was going on. And that women actually want something that's very different from what men want from women. Men aren't looking for a tender defender from women. But but we were never allowed to talk about that. And so, and I listened to it with my wife in the car, and she's like, yeah, that's right. We need to tell our sons this.
Wow. That's incredible. That's really incredible.
So part of me is like, okay, I just want to talk about like how a neutered culture makes marriage really hard.
Yeah.
Right. I have this image of a book, like the title is something like Romance in an Age of Androgyny, which I think is just a great title. I don't know what to do with it, but anyway. Well, so that's.
I appreciate you saying that. And I'll say where I'm coming from also, just so we're putting all our disclosures out there. For me, I've been fascinated by this because in the last conversation we had on your podcast was related to dating. And so I put this program Dating Well together. And as I've been kind of continually diving into that arena and want to continue to be a support to people, one of the areas that I want to draw more attention to that I do a little bit in the program, but not enough, is really kind of this attraction piece and the first dates, and how do we ask people out? How do we even make those moves from the very beginning before we even get into serious relationships, where the bulk of Dating Well is, I certainly have one of the lessons is on the first date, kind of laying out the stages. So I do talk about it a little bit, but I feel like there's so much more attention that needs to be drawn to that. And that's what I'm working on now. So I'm working on another resource that I haven't worked out the title yet, but something to the effect of Dating with Hope, because I really want to attack the cynicism that emerges in the dating culture, and I get why people feel despondent by it because of the difficulties that's there. But I really want to focus in on kind of this attraction piece and getting dates and going on first dates and what all of that looks like. So really those early stages of a relationship and how to establish even healthy patterns right from the get-go, because it's important for us to be able to do that. And so I'm coming into it similarly. I'm reading all this stuff. Again, I'm not an expert. I don't think I've done an exhaustive research. I'm not going to claim to be an expert on evolutionary psychology as we go into today's conversation, but at least just to say that I'm very interested in learning more and beginning to talk about it and formulating some ideas.
So here's a funny story. So we met because I had written a book on dating years ago, and a mutual friend of ours thought that would make me an interesting conversation for you because of the work you were doing with your online course. So that was the connection. Yeah. Now here's the thing about my book. In my book that I wrote 10 years ago, there's practically nothing. I think there might be a couple little spots, maybe around like family planning or something, but there's practically nothing about the differences between men and women. And this is really interesting. So there's two different covers of the book for the Canadian and the American version. And the Canadian cover, we had nothing to do with the covers. Publishers make their covers. Right. The Canadian version, there's two teenagers sitting on like this old couch, this vintage like 70s couch that was in your parents' basement in the 90s, right? And the girl is looking off away from the guy. And the guy is looking at the girl. And what the picture communicates is that the girl is expecting the guy to do something. And the guy is looking at the girl knowing he's supposed to do something, but he doesn't know what. Right. And so there's a very, there's a gendered sort of pattern in the picture. The American version is a boy and a girl holding hands, facing away from the camera. So what you see is they're held hands, and then the parts of their bodies that are within a rectangular frame from their held hands. So the tops of their jeans and the bottom of their t-shirts on half of their bodies, right? And they're wearing matching white t-shirts and more or less matching jeans, and they're holding hands and they're looking in the same direction together. Yeah. Right. And it's fascinating that the same book has two different covers, one of which has an image of sort of gender, call it equality, and another which is a sort of asymmetrical understanding of at least how the pursuit element works, right? And it was just like, I'm not opposed to the true thing that both of those covers are trying to represent. I'm all on board for it. Right. But it's fascinating that the book never talks about those things. But when you have to make an image, you're gonna represent something about that. Right. Right. So I that was fascinating. But if I was to rewrite the book now, or if I was to write it for married couples now, I mean, it might just be like the supplementary chapter that was missing 10 years ago is the new book, which happens to be twice as long as the first one. And it's what I've learned being a married person who happens to be a man who's married to a woman, and that we're not the same kind of thing. And if someone would have told us that at the beginning, it would have saved us a lot of trouble. Yes. 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 So
yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that we can't, I don't always say this, you said equality, same, gender equality. And it's really, of course, gender sameness. The church, of course, professes that we are equal as far as of equal worth, but we're not the same. And that's where our culture really does not understand that anymore. It doesn't understand that there can be equality, but not sameness, because we view both of those the same. In order for equality to exist, there has to be sameness. And that, of course, is just not what we understand. And not what the research kind of supports either. I'll share this. It may not be the right time for this, but this is an anecdote that I was thinking about. There's been a strong push with regards to women's sports and how do we get women to view sports, and by creating sports leagues, that are primarily that are women. And so like, you watch NFL games and they have commercials of girls playing flag football, that somehow this is what's going to get girls enticed, because this speaks to the sameness and the equality. You know what got girls watching NFL football this season? Taylor Swift.
Right.
It wasn't commercials of girls playing flag football. It was, let's take the most famous woman in the world right now and let's insert her. And I'm not saying it's a conspiracy. I'm not going into all of that, but I'm just saying like when Taylor Swift started dating Jason Kelce, all of a sudden every high school girl had a Travis Kelce jersey, started watching football games. You know, why? Because it communicates that there's something different. Taylor Swift isn't playing flag football, but her presence just coming into the NFL space has brought more women to watch football than anything the NFL has done over the last 5 years.
Right. I coach my kids' sports teams. So I coached Toby and Oscar, who are now my teenage boys, coached their baseball teams for years. And then my daughter Daisy started playing softball. Mm-hmm. And so I wasn't the head coach. I helped out a little, but I went to most of the games when I could. And I'd go to her games. And the fascinating thing about girls softball, so she was like 9 or 10 when this was happening. The primary focus for the vast majority of the team are the chants.
Yeah.
They chant the whole game. They go home and they Google new chants and they come back and they teach each other chants. They don't know at the end of the game, they don't know what the score is. They'll ask, like, did we win or did we lose? Like, they don't know. Uh-huh. No one has a clue what the score is. Yeah. But they're memorizing chants, they're teaching chants, they're competing with the other team for chants. They're chanting 90% of the time when they're in the bench together is chanting, right? And boys don't. They might learn one or two like fun little quirky things that take up less than 5% of your time when you're there. The boys know what the score is. They know whether the guy ahead of them in the lineup struck out or got a hit in the last inning. Like all the girls don't have a clue.
Right.
And it's fascinating to watch. Like and when people try to change them, you can't. Right. So this idea that like, that might be because they're socialized in different ways. Mm-hmm. No, people try to socialize them out of those things. And now this is a bigger picture than sports, but more generally as a parent, to shame boys for being masculine and to shame girls for being feminine so that everyone feels terrible about themselves and is trying to be something that they're not. And when you try to like socialize them out of what they naturally do as individuals or as groups, it just doesn't work. Mm-hmm. You could not stop those girls from chanting. Mm-mm. You couldn't do it without like extreme punitive measures. And you couldn't get boys to chant for 90% of a game. You couldn't do it, you know? And it's fascinating to watch those kinds of dynamics as a parent and the ways in which the culture responds to them. Sometimes positively, but sometimes like there's discomfort that something is too obviously masculine or feminine. So we need to like downplay it or explain it away or do some weird thing with it, which watching my kids grow up, it just feels confusing to them when those things happen.
Yeah. Here's another cultural example. Movies. So Marvel for years now has been trying to ram, female superheroes. Fine. Okay. No problem. We get it. All right. But those movies are not doing as well. But the whole intention was, let's bring women to the Marvel platform. If we create female superheroes, we'll get women coming to the movies, and that's how we will continue to expand kind of our reach. Hasn't happened. The Marvel movies that have been featuring women just haven't been performing well because the primary base of Marvel is men, and they're not looking for that. So how do you get women to the movies? Oh, you make a Barbie movie. And the Barbie movie is the largest movie of last year. Just play to your strengths. Does it mean that there aren't girls who are ultra competitive and care about the score and know the lineup? Absolutely. Of course there are. Does it mean that there aren't girls who are deeply invested in the Marvel universe and keeping track with? Of course they are. But when we look at large strokes generalizations, by and large, we're not seeing that hold up. By and large, we're seeing, of course, these differences that are very clear, and we see it. This is 2024. I'm not talking about 40 years ago. I'm talking about cultural experiences that are happening right now, which to some degree gives me hope because it means that, like, even as we continue down this androgyny path, like, there's still clear markers here that that we can only go so
Right.
far.
Right. I mean, the Barbie movie is fascinating because in its attempts to undermine gender stereotypes, it relies on them.
100%.
I mean, right.
100%.
And that's a whole other episode.
Yeah, we
but
can talk about that. Exactly.
It's fascinating that you can't do it without sort of sawing off the branch you're sitting on.
Yes.
Right. It's a fascinating kind of development. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So talk about the relationships though. I know you were going to say something about marriage and kind of this we want to get to, in terms of like, what are the things that we would have liked to have been told when we were dating, when we were married about these differences that you've learned now that, would help.
Right.
Or yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so one thing that was really fascinating for me that I heard recently is how men and women seek bonding differently. Mm-hmm. This applies to the bedroom as much as it applies to like conversation about how your day went, like it across the field, right? And it has to do with actually the different bonding hormones. Men and women don't have primarily the same bonding hormone. Mm-hmm. We all have oxytocin, but that's more primary for women, and vasopressin is more primary for men. And so we do this all the time. I do this in diaconate formation, right? When you're teaching men, we say that a massive part of what you do in diaconate formation is teach people how to listen, right? And so, because ministry requires listening, right? So you go to a hospital, you go to a prison, you got to be able to listen to people, right? And one of the starting points is always like, okay, so your wife, comes to you and she's got this problem and whatever is going on. What do you do, right? Mm-hmm. And like any guy who's been married for, these are mostly middle-aged men and later. So they've typically been married for 20 plus years. Yeah. And they're like, yeah, don't try to solve her problem right away. Right? Like your first goal is to show her that you hear and understand how she feels.
Right.
Right? And for whatever reason, we are comfortable saying that to men, that men need to structure their listening and their interactions around that kind of principle. And what I hadn't realized before is like, what's the biochemical reason behind that? Well, a woman is seeking to bond with you when she's expressing whatever problem it is that she's expressing. And the way that she will feel bonded to you is if you can sort of identify with her problem and show that you hear and understand her, right? But what is the typical male response that you have to be trained out of? Well, it's to try solve the problem. And men get confused when women don't like the solutions that men offer. Like, why did you come talk to me then if I can't, why did you tell me about this problem if you don't even want my solution, right?
Right.
But what I've noticed is we shame men for this kind of thing. But what men are actually doing is they're trying to bond with women. Because the way that men bond is by achieving things as a team.
Right. That's
what vasopressin does, right? It's activated by like team achievement. So male friendships, for instance, the epidemic of like middle-aged male loneliness, right? Women will keep a relationship for the relationship's sake. They'll call their sister, their mom, their college friend just to talk.
Right.
Men never do that
with
or almost never, with their college friends. Men's relationships tend to revolve around activities. You're in a band, you're in a sports team, you're in a service club, you do something with your brothers, right? That's how, and so women bond with women in a certain way and men bond with men in a certain way. But when men and women are trying to bond with each other, you have two different things going on.
Yeah.
And we tell men, rightly, that they need to understand the difference and accommodate themselves to the person who they want to bond with. I've never heard the suggestion that we do the reverse, which is to teach women how men are trying to bond with them and say, like, this guy is looking for a teammate who will help him achieve his goals.
That's fascinating. Yeah.
And when he talks to you about those goals, and he's excited about them. We have a word for that now in our culture. We call that mansplaining, right? And men are shamed for it.
Yeah.
But what they're actually doing is reaching out to someone that they care about and trying to establish a partnership that will work together on things, right? And so like when Flannery and I discovered that, like it made sense of so much in our relationship, including, and I want to be careful how much detail to go in here, but like including what the other person likes in the bedroom, right? Because
Well, let's stop there. How about we stop there?
Yeah,
Okay.
okay.
So before we go there,
Right,
not
yeah,
that I'm
yeah.
trying to censor you, right? We could talk about that,
no.
but just let's
Sure.
tackle some of these themes that you're bringing up, which is just absolutely brilliant. The Michael Gurian, who's another one of these kind of writers about the differences between men and women, and particularly just focuses on boys, he calls some of what you're speaking about in terms of differences between empathy, that girls have what's referred to as a nurturing empathy. And the example that he gives is exactly this. So let's say we're talking about a bunch of kids are playing soccer, and the boy gets his leg hurt by the opposing team from some slide tackle. The kid falls down. Girls are more likely to come over and offer a nurturing empathy, which is, hey, how are you doing? Is it hurting? Are you okay? Do you just need to stay down? Why don't you just kind of rest and make sure that it's all okay? The boys on the team will respond with what Michael Gurian refers to as aggressive empathy, which is, hey, you okay? Oh, walk it off. Let's go. We need you, And so this sense of we need you is what drives guys. So it's not that there's still empathy and there's still an understanding that there's pain, but there's a higher purpose, I would say, to it, in the sense that we're trying to still achieve our goal. And so, yes, we understand you're experiencing pain, but we still need to achieve this goal. And so this sense of togetherness is us working together to achieve the goal. And so the aggressive empathy is the way that the boys kind of respond. And that's fascinating what you talked about with vasopressin. The word that I've heard kind of associated with that is like gallantry. Okay. That's the way that we experience, kind of this bonding. And it kind of goes back to the same sense that like we're trying to achieve, we're trying to take care, we're trying to provide. And so even when it comes to men, again, relationships, the way you said it was right on. That I think about it even with the guys who are my closest friends. They're people that I've gone to battle with. They're people that I've worked with for years, that we've struggled on tasks. We see problems similarly, and we're able to have those conversations. Now, I am a therapist, and so I am able to have just conversations about how we're doing, how's the family, how's the kids, but we talk about all of it for sure. But the motivation primarily is centers around kind of tasks and accomplishments. And so what's a practical takeaway for that? When we're talking to boys, it's really hard just to sit down with boys and be like, hey, how are you doing? Tell me how you're feeling. What works better for us is let's go shoot hoops together. Let's go fishing together. Let's go on a walk together. When we're active, when we're doing some task, when we're performing, let's go build a tree fort together. Let's go do something together. And in the context of doing something, then we can actually start having some more meaningful conversations around that.
Right. Oh, okay. Two things. First, when I was in like grade 4 or 5, we were going to family counseling about something or other. And I remember this scene where I was supposed to write my feelings down. Mm-hmm. And there was a giant stack of paper, and my mom would shove one in front of me, and I would grab it and crumple it up in a ball and throw it on the floor. Yeah. And then she gave me another one. And by the time we were done, I had not written one word. Yeah. But there was a giant pile of crumpled paper on the floor, right? She wasn't going to, like, there was just no way in for me as a 9-year-old boy to be told that I need to write my feelings on a piece of paper. Right. Like there was just no way at all. So that's one story. The second story is one of the first cracks in our androgynous marriage, right? One of the places where we figured
That's
out...
the title of your book. Yes.
Yep.
I mean, you said it before, saving our androgynous marriage or breaking free from our androgynous marriage. Yeah.
Was when we started having kids, and it became clear to us, and I think we got some affirmation from some reasonable parenting resource that actually understood the difference between men and women. That it might have been from a marriage counselor. I'm not sure. Anyways, it rang true. It rang true, and it worked very effectively. And it was that what children, boys or girls, what children need from their father is a sense that they can go out in the world and do things. Yeah. And what children need from their mother, boys or girls, in different ways, but still boys and girls both need this from their mom, is a sense that there is a place that is safe for them in the world, in the home, right? And that before it clicked on communication or bedroom or anything else, it clicked on parenting, where we understood that my job as a father was to give my kids a sense of their own worth and competence and ability so that they could go out and do things. And that her job was to give them that safe place where they could always come home to, no matter how it went out in the world.
Yeah.
And when we started doing that, which was very early on with the first kids, it just worked.
Yes.
And I would attribute our kids, touch wood here. Our kids are doing pretty darn well. They're comfortable in their own skin. They can go out and do things. Generally, when people meet them, they're like, wow, like these kids got it together, and some significant percentage of that is because we wrapped our heads around that aspect of our gendered parenting roles early on. And it maps onto what you said about what the boys or the girls say when there's an injury on the sports field. Like, I was out there, we were skinning our knees, we were climbing trees, we were taking risks.
Yep.
And we were learning not only about the particular things, like how to climb a tree, but about our own capacity to meet challenges.
All right, folks. Well, this is Dr. Mario Sacasa here. We're taking a quick break from my conversation with Dr. Brett Salkeld to encourage you to check out faithandmarriage.org. Specifically, I want you to check out Dating Well. Listen, if you are in the dating market, if you are single, if you know somebody who's single, if you're a young adult or a college student who's beginning to ask questions about what we're talking about here and wondering, well, how can I bring this about? How can I discern marriage with somebody? How can I really know what it means to ask somebody out and to engage in a romantic relationship that is healthy and strong? How can I look at my own relationship if you are dating right now and assess whether or not it is healthy and strong? I got you covered. That's what we cover in Dating Well. So please head on over to faithandmarriage.org and click on the link, and you can see where Dating Well is, and we will be happy to be able to provide for you this resource that will guide you through whatever questions you have about the dating experience. We have had hundreds of students go through the course already, and I'm telling you, it is helping people, and it is a tremendous privilege to be able to see the way that it is helping folks. And so check it out, Dating Well, look it up, and grateful that we're able to help and provide this resource to folks. Kristen and I, we've had lots of conversations about all this. And one of the ways that I think I'm very grateful for my wife and the many conversations we've had. And she is not a girly girl in the sense that she doesn't, she would rather be doing the stuff that we're doing rather than, getting her nails done and getting her hair done, which is fine, but she doesn't have much interest in that. And so if there was ever a woman that was born to raise 4 boys, it's my dear wife. Like she excels, she loves it. She's a great boy mom. But she's still a girl, she's still a woman.
Right.
And so her MO primarily is still pulling towards safety and towards, like you said, making sure that we are protecting them. And I'm like I said earlier, I joked about it. I'm a male. Yes, absolutely. And I am a therapist. And so I do pay attention to emotions. I do pay attention to, empathy and making sure that those things are there, but I am still a guy. And so it does come out in terms of sometimes where it's just like, all right, like we got to go, let's go do this. And so one clear example of this, and this was a number of years ago, but we went to Colorado, and this is the first time going to like the Rockies and seeing these big mountains and doing all this. And our last day we were there, we were hiking, and we hiked around this beautiful lake that had it's just incredible. It's Glacier Lake, mountains right next to it. And as we're kind of done with the hike and we're leaving, we could see there are a bunch of young adults climbing up the rocks a little bit, getting to a ledge and then jumping off of the ledge into the water. And the boys were a little younger. This was 2017. So I don't know, they're probably like 12, 8, 6, somewhere in that ballpark, and I could see that they're kind of looking at the young people jumping off the ledges, and they want it, but they don't want to ask. They're a little nervous, they're not sure what they're supposed to do. So I was like, all right, here's a dad moment. Like, let's go. So I was like, I can see you guys want to do it. Let's go. And so we walked around the lake, walked up the rocks and saw how they got up there and what they were doing, how they're jumping off. And I was like, all right, let's go do this. So I jumped off first, and then the 12-year-old, and then the 8-year-old, and then eventually the 6-year-old. He was the most nervous of the bunch, of course, but they all did it. My 2-year-old at the time wanted to do it. But of course he wasn't big enough, And so after we jumped, he was like, but Dad, I can get those, and he was pointing to like the little floaties, that the kids wear, because he wanted to, he didn't want to be left behind. But those are the moments where, I'm not saying that a mom couldn't have done that for sure, but there was something uniquely dad about that moment where it's like, we got to go. Like, I could see you're a little afraid. We got to push through that fear. And that's a great lesson for us in life, because sometimes the fear response, the appropriate action is to rest, is to retreat into that attachment, into finding that place of safety. But there are other times where the appropriate action or response to the fear is pushing through it and engaging with it and combating it. And that's always where the balance is. And so if we are kind of raised in an environment where there's a constant kind of push and pull in that, then we actually get a well-rounded experience, and we get a very healthy emotional makeup as a response to it.
Right. Let me throw a situation at you.
Fire.
That's happened in our home in terms of parenting, and see what sense you can make of this, because I don't know exactly how this works, but to me it's a fascinating example. So we have like a preteen girl, right? Mm-hmm. And if rumors are true, preteen girls and moms have some conflict, right? And we're starting to see this, right? So I'll get home and it was a rough day between mom and Daisy, right? They've been at each other, and they like neither of them know what to do with the other, and they're kind of in a huff and whatever. And it's like, okay, so what are you gonna do, Dad? You came home and leave. I discovered, yeah, right. Well, now is the time to step into the.
I gotta go cut the grass. I gotta.
Right. I got to step into the problem and be a man. And I've discovered just by fluke, fluke, I've found something that works, not 100% of the time, but like way more than you would think. Mm-hmm. And I approached my daughter, and I tried to be like tender, and hey, like had a rough day. How are you doing? Or whatever. Yeah. And she pushes me. Like she'll like, first she'll kind of shoo me away. Or if I get too close, she'll push me and she'll kind of grunt, mm-hmm. And I could be like, okay, like, I guess you don't want to talk to your dad. Mm-hmm. But I just started teasing her. Yeah. I was like, oh, you want to fight? Yeah. Let's go. Yeah. Like, is that what you need right now? Yeah. And so we'll lock arms and we'll kind of wrestle, and like, she'll get pretty vigorous, and I'll keep it toned down to an appropriate, for someone who weighs more than twice as much as she does, I gotta like dial it back. Right. But just enough to protect myself and mm-hmm. kind of like give her something to push against. Mm-hmm. to have, some exertion. Mm-hmm. And then I'll tease her and I'll poke her and tickle her, and we'll wrestle a little bit, and her mood will shift dramatically in that time. And sometimes she'll start laughing. Then she's angry at me for making her laugh, which is funny in itself. Right. Yeah. And pretty soon the tension between her and her mom like is largely dissipated. Mm-hmm. Right. And now you can tell me a little if you know about why that works. But the fascinating thing for me is like her mom would never try that solution. Mm-hmm. And probably if she tried it,
wouldn't work.
When she's the one fighting with it, there's no chance it works. Right? Like it's a very daddy-daughter move. Mm-hmm. And it depends a bit on the personality of the kid. My next kid, I will be surprised if it works on Dorothy. Right. The way it works on Daisy, because they have different personalities, and Dorothy's much more passive, Daisy's much more assertive and stuff. But I'll try it and we'll see. Yeah. But anyways, like, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think it's brilliant, and the reason I think it works is because what's happening is that they're getting into gridlock throughout the day, and they're locking horns, like you said, and so it is a battle that's present there, and so. Competitiveness does happen with women too. It just looks differently than it does for guys. It tends to be more social, and so that's where kind of social cues, and at its worst, of course, is the mean girls and manipulation and all of that. So it's not a physical kind of competition that like happens like with guys in terms of like who can score the most points or the most touchdowns. But nevertheless, like what's happening certainly is that their stress is high. I would imagine that they're primarily activating, their sympathetic nervous system and in that fight or flight response. But because they don't necessarily activate that physically, that it's just this kind of war of words that's happening. And so there's a sense of competition and an infighting that's there. So then you step in and you're causing a change in a breaking of that gridlock. Which is that you're interjecting yourself and saying, all right, well, like you're teasing her. And so with teasing her, that's helpful because what it's doing is it's getting her out of kind of that stuck, kind of limbic, kind of emotional center kind of our brain where we can kind of get wrapped up in our own thinking and just kind of get stuck in that space. You're forcing her kind of out of that through the teasing, through the joking. Again, appropriately, it's done obviously in a way that's respectful. But then even some of that physicality, again, girls need that also. It's not just something that boys need too. And so there's a little bit of a space that you're giving for her to be able to kind of get some of that aggression out in a way that is more corporal, I would say, and not just through the words.
Right.
So to some degree, what it sounds like it's doing is it's kind of hitting the reset for her a little bit.
Right.
When it hits the reset, now she can kind of get out of that high emotion state and be a little bit calmer. And when we're a little bit calmer, our prefrontal cortex is engaged. We're a little bit clearer in our thinking. And now we can actually assess the problems and assess the situation from a clearer perspective, which then gives her opportunities to come up with better solutions to whatever the conflict is, to just even thinking about her mom a little bit more positively. And it's giving a little bit more space for that to happen, as opposed to just being kind of in that gridlock state of mind.
Right.
Which is really important for us as couples. So what's the analog for that, in relationships is that if we find ourselves in that state of gridlock, we that's a bad place to be. And so sometimes even like humor can go a long way. So humor can go a long way. Actually, touch can go a long way too in marriage. Like if you're really angry, if you just go over and like just grab her hand or just like touch her shoulder, or just actually make some type of physical contact like that can significantly reduce, some of that and get us out of that state. Because when we're stuck in that gridlock, all we're doing is exacerbating this, I would say, reaction within us that wants to get even, that wants to get back. Like that defensiveness is built within us. And then what happens most of the times after we get into like a really heated discussion with our spouse is that, it's just a matter of who wins and trying to get our last word in. But as soon as the argument's over and we've gone in our separate ways and we've slammed the doors and we start, diffusing the emotion, it's usually like regret, is the first word that comes in, right? It's usually like, why did I allow it to get to that point? Like, why did I say those things? That's because now your conscience is kicking in. And so if we can minimize or reduce rather the excitability of that, the intensity of that, then we'll be in a better place. And it doesn't.
Right.
And so there's ways of doing that. Certainly empathy, cracking jokes, kind of, distractions, different things that kind of break the tension. Those things absolutely are invaluable for us in relationships.
Right. And giving someone, if any way of letting off steam is going to be perceived negatively, right? Then you got to bottle it up until it completely blows.
Yeah.
Right. And so if two people are in a place where they there's no appropriate way to let that go, giving someone a chance to push and tug and, fight a little bit, allows you to release, because energy, like anger, builds energy.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that's like actually what it's for.
Yes.
It's to give you energy to achieve things, because anger implies something is wrong in the world that needs fixing. Right. Yep. So you have all this energy, but there's no good outlet for it that's not destructive in your immediate context. And if you can release it in a kind of a healthy way, then it makes so much sense to me what you just said about like, you sort of down-regulate and other things come online so that you can think more clearly, or your conscience starts to say, hey, maybe this isn't the way, or, that kind of stuff. So that makes... Now, can I jump off something else you said, which I think is really fascinating? You said there's male-male competition and there's female-female competition.
Right.
That's true of both groups, but they do it differently. And I think that principle actually is very helpful more generally, which is it's not that men need these things and women need those things, or men are this way and or women are that way. But rather that there's a lot of things that we have in common, but the approach is like asymmetrical is the best word I have for it. So I'll throw one example out at you. There's a stereotype that men make decisions rationally and women make decisions emotionally. Well, I know why that stereotype exists, because there's something about it that it's trying to say that's true in our experience of ourselves as men or as women. But there's also something like deeply wrong about that kind of simplistic thing, because men always make decisions with emotions and women are always engaging their reason in their decisions. So both men and women use reason and emotion in their decision making, but the way they use them is not the same.
Yeah.
Is that?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I do. And the reality is we all use emotion to make decisions, which is why commercials and advertising appeal to emotions, not to reason.
Exactly.
They're very effective, in terms of appealing to emotion. So what are the emotions then that they appeal to? And what is it that guys are looking for versus what is it that girls are looking for? And what is it that appeals to us in a certain way versus what appeals to us in a different way? The things that are going to be more attractive and appealing to men are going to be different than the things that are attractive and appealing to women.
Right.
And so
that goes to your point about football and Marvel movies and whatever else.
Yes.
I mean, we're all watching whatever it is we're watching more for emotional reasons than for rational ones.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
But still, men and women, it's not that men are watching things because they're rational and women watch things because they're emotional. We're all watching things more for emotional than for rational reasons, but we're watching different things.
Correct.
Because our emotional needs are different.
Yes.
It's not that one of us is not emotional.
Right. That's right. And so I have a couple thoughts here. I'm sorry, I'm getting tongue-tied because I have a couple thoughts that I want to say. So I'll go back to another cultural example. Then let's get back to like family stuff. So again, something I saw on YouTube. Rafael Nadal was being interviewed about like the gender pay gap, in sports, and his response was, I don't have much to say, about that. I don't really know the economics of it all. It says, but I do know that female supermodels make a whole lot more than male models do,
Interesting.
Again, we go back to the sense of we're equal in worth, but we're not exactly the same. And so we're speaking to, that's the theme that we want to kind of get to. But what was the question that you asked? You're saying in terms of
the general pattern that
men make
we
decisions.
have the same,
but decision making. Decision making. So is it true that men tend to think things a little bit more rationally? I think there's absolutely some truth to that. But guys are a little more wired towards logical thinking to begin with. It's why there are more male engineers than female engineers. And women tend to feel things a little bit more, which is why there are more female counselors and nurses than there are male counselors and nurses. Because it just, again, we speak to these generalities that are present. And again, the little bit that I know in terms of differences between men and women's brains, and my resources here is Louann Brizendine, who I recommend her books. And what she says is that, if I'm quoting her correctly, 85 or 90% of male and female brains are the same. But there's like a 10 or 15% difference, and it's those 10 or 50% differences where we see kind of these stereotypes, and not stereotypes, where these differences in behavior kind of emerging. And one of the places is that with women tend to have more interconnectedness across the brain, which is why they're able to kind of have a lot of those conversations, in I guess, euphemistically, this has been referred to as kind of like the spaghetti brain. That's not Louann Brizendine's work. But then men have more interconnectedness within the different components of the brain. So less interconnectedness across, but more inside each of these components, which is what allows us to have a little bit more of a one-track mind, for good or for ill, And so when we're able to be focused, we can be focused on a task and put aside all the emotion to get the task done. Women tend to have everything and hold everything in context, which makes sometimes challenge. It makes it difficulty to accomplish things because you're thinking about everything all at once and overwhelmed about it all, as opposed to just being able to set aside and focus on the one thing.
Right.
So guys tend to operate more linearly, more logically in that regard. But that doesn't mean that they don't have emotions. We absolutely do have emotions. That's very clear. And emotionality, of course, does play into it as well, in whatever decisions are that we make.
So, and now let me try something here. I mean, one of the things that seems to be presumed in a lot of these conversations is that the rational is better than the emotional.
Right.
And therefore, if you said what you just said, then you're saying, you're covering it all with this nice neurobiology and whatever, but you're really saying actually that men are better. And that, I know you're not, but I mean,
I actually will give you a clear example where I will push back on that. And so this is a conversation that I had with a friend of mine in seminary formation. One of the real downfalls of seminary formation is that we do not have enough women as formators.
Okay.
And why is that an issue? Well, because if we have a hyper masculine approach, then we have a hyper masculine way of evaluating the men. We need women to help us to balance out the evaluations. So this might be a little bit too nebulous to put into the PPF. This is the challenge with it. But like, women can determine who's a creep and who's not. You put her in a room with a seminarian, and she'll know right away who makes her feel uncomfortable and who doesn't. Is that not something that we would want to know before we ordain these guys?
Right. That's a perfect example.
So there absolutely is a different way of. I'm not saying that the rational is better. I'm saying that there's different ways of being able to assess situations, and to our peril, we pull to one extreme versus the other. If everything is completely emotional, then we're losing some of the rationality. But if everything's completely rational, then we're losing the input that emotion gives also. And I say sincerely, seminary formation is one of those places where we do see that.
Right. No, that's a great example, because I think the desire is to say, no, women are very rational, because we just presume in our basic discussion that rationality is good.
Right.
And what we rarely recognize in these conversations is rationality, absent certain kinds of context, can actually become a kind of pathology.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And so the example you gave goes exactly where I was going, right? Because it shows that actually we need to be able to integrate both of them into our decision making, and everybody actually would agree with your example that, like, we need more women's input in seminary formation, but a lot of people who would agree with that would feel really awkward if you say women make decisions differently than men make decisions. They're like, hold on, we don't want to say that. Well, then the follow through is then we don't need women in seminary formation, but actually we do.
But
right?
even in marriage, right? I mean, like I've learned that this push and pull. Early on in our relationship, I used to like get frustrated by it. It was like, why can't you just see it my way and then get on the ship? Like, this is where we're heading. Like let's go. And what I've realized is that her perspective is valued input. It's valued data in the decision that needs to be made. And so I cannot just kind of bulldoze this thing. Whatever the decision is, I need to step back and take her input into consideration. And that means her timing, her pace. That means the things that she's seeing, and giving space for those conversations to emerge. If I just poo-poo it, or if I just diminish it, then I'm demeaning her. And again, to my peril, to whatever the decision that I'm trying to make, because that input is absolutely valuable.
Right.
Yeah.
So so this goes to something that
one more thing. Sorry to interrupt you, but this is the point that I'm really trying to get, is that our society, as feminist as we've become, as pro-woman as we've become, we actually are not pro-woman. What we actually are doing is we really want women to be like men. And the more that we can make women be like men, then will we be successful, which then is conversely saying that women are still bad and inferior to the male disposition, because it's the masculine disposition that matters most. That's the one that we're supposed to achieve. And if everybody can get like that, then all the other stuff, and it's like, no. If
we say women can do everything men can do, we're setting men as the standard. No one's out there saying men
Right.
can do everything women
Right.
can do.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Why do we not see that as a valuable thing to say? Because that would actually make women the standard.
Yes.
So like
Yes.
it's this really weird backhanded move that women can do anything men can do just means that you've set women up.
But we
as
can't
this
say,
sort
but
of-
we know we can't say that because men can't have babies.
Right. Well, sure. I mean,
like
there's lots of
examples,
things
obviously, but
that you could do. But the point is that the standard is the male standard.
absolutely,
Right.
absolutely.
And that sets you up to fail before you've started.
Correct.
Because the only successful woman is one who's like a man, right? And that's like,
well, and that's what
you
we're
can't
seeing.
win that game,
Well,
right?
and
Yeah.
that's what we're seeing. That's exactly.
And at
what
the
we're seeing.
same time, we shame men for being men.
Yes.
So then we end up like terribly confused, right? So one of the things that some imagined book on the androgynous marriage, when you were talking about how you had to learn in decision making to take different kinds of input, right? That your wife was much better suited to bring than you were.
Right.
I think actually points to something about marriage as a sacrament and as a sort of what's the word I want? Track, recipe. I'm not coming up with a good word. A venue for growing in holiness.
Yes.
Because like you and I can bond as men,
Right.
and there's good in that. There's virtue in that. We become better people in that, right? And women can bond with women the same way. But there's something about bonding with someone whose emotional, physical, whatever other kinds of desires and needs and fears are in a certain way fundamentally different from yours, that forces you to grow in a way that you're never forced to grow if you only have to bond with other people who are like you in those ways. Right. And I mean, it's true that men differ from other men, and they can become healthier, more integrated people by learning to work with men who are different from them. But there's something fundamental about that marriage relationship between a man and a woman where men need to learn exactly what you described, how to take other things into account. And there's challenges that living with a man presents to women that are not just challenges to like put up with because, can't live with them, can't live without them kind of thing, but they're actually things that are oriented to your good. You become a better, more integrated, happier person if you can understand and work with this person who has different needs than you.
Yeah.
And like that has been part of it's a slow and bloody process.
Yeah.
But that's been part of what we've seen in our marriage, especially in recent years when we started figuring this out, is the kind of willingness to set aside what seems obvious to you on either side, to understand the needs or the desires or the fears or whatever it is of the other person that seem really foreign and inexplicable precisely because they're not masculine or feminine and you are, right? And like that has just been so rich, and that's what I feel like we were robbed of that.
Yeah.
That when no one would tell us about that as a young married couple, and we had to earn it.
Yeah.
And
so the example that you gave kind of when you first emailed to me, I think is worth bringing up. So I'm going to steal your thunder here a little bit, which is that, because I've heard this before, kind of in counseling, that it's like, well, this comes up a lot. It came up in the interview with the Modern Wisdom one, but it comes up a lot in the counseling kind of world or literature, is that, well, pornography is healthy for relationships because there's a mismatch when it comes to sexual desire. And so like, let's just let the guys kind of express themselves to whatever degree is possible to figure it out. And then, the wife isn't burdened by that. Well, the challenge that so logically, okay, we're like, okay, logically, well, maybe actually logically, well, that kind of makes sense on paper, no, it doesn't. Like, let's dig deeper into what's happening. What it does is it creates an aversion. It creates an opportunity to not have the difficult conversation that needs to be had, because you can just go get entertained or whatever done on your own, as opposed to actually forcing you to kind of stay in the game and to have hard conversations about differences and preferences and desires. And those conversations are magic. Like, this is exactly what you were saying, is that like marriage is a saint-making vehicle. And the ways that happens is certainly through the experiences of life, the hardships that happen to us, but also just how it forces us to have these conversations. Because when we're forced to have these conversations about the places that we're different, it pulls something out of us. And if we can have those conversations, again, with respect and a foundation of love, then they're going to be challenging, but they pull something out of us to be able to take somebody else's perspective, to be able to see it, and then to be able to operate appropriately. If the advice is just go look at porn, then you're robbing a couple of the opportunity to actually have those meaningful discussions that need to be had. Now, pornography is problematic in relationships for a whole host of reasons. It introduces comparison, et cetera, et cetera. Couples that look at porn report being less satisfied with their body image, with their performance, all of those things, because all of that is putting our attention again back on the things that don't matter. And so the other reason that that's problematic is that what we're doing is we're just focusing on what is the most superficial. And marriage is the opposite of superficiality. If you want a superficial relationship, then just go have a string of hookups. They can all be the exact same girl in terms of type, look, dress, whatever it is that you want. You can have a certain thing, or if you want to change it up or be variable, okay, that's fine. But all that just becomes incredibly superficial. But right. Marriage is a vehicle that as a sacrament, it's pulling us deeper into the mystery of who this person is, the eternity that is present. And as we continue to peer into that's where that kind of breaking off of the false self happens. That's where the shelving it off, the scales, the dead skin, like all that starts to fall off as we continue to kind of dive into each other's mysteries.
Right. So I mean, we only got about 10 minutes.
I know.
So to reveal the mystery from the beginning of the podcast, I listened to this episode of Modern Wisdom, and the question is a fascinating one from the point of view of evolutionary psychology, which Chris Williamson is really interested in. So he has an evolutionary psychologist who wrote a book on it come on to talk about it, and I'm thinking this will be interesting. Mm-hmm. And the question was, and this might have to be a whole separate episode to go into some of the details. So we'll just introduce it here and then tie back into what you were saying. The question, the increase in cuckolding. Yeah. So meaning that a man whose sort of sexual excitement is generated by watching his wife with other men, mm-hmm. right? So Chris Williamson is like, well, evolutionarily, this makes zero sense, right? You can't having someone else, take your mating opportunities makes zero sense from an evolutionary point of view. And so he wanted to pick this guy's brain on it. And the guy seemed like utterly incurious mm-hmm. about it both from an evolutionary point of view, but then I think there's
actually just
much
to say
deeper
quickly,
psychological things going on.
I'm not sure if that guy was an evolutionary psychologist, to be honest.
Oh, maybe not.
I don't think he was, because he kind of was speaking against some of evolutionary psychology's kind of dictums or concerns.
Okay.
So
maybe I
I don't think that he was. He was a researcher, absolutely, and he was a researcher specifically on the questions of affairs, of cuckolding, of ethical non-monogamy, as it's called.
Right.
And his disposition was completely just one that was like, this is all okay. Right. So, but keep going to the point that you're making. Okay.
Yeah. So his angle was something like, look, we got to get over thinking that various people's sort of predilections are weird, and then we can, understand them better.
Stop moralizing, I think was the exact phraseology he used. Yeah.
That was the kind of angle. But then that left him zero capacity. I appreciate that there's something, if you really want to understand someone, you can't start from a place of judgment.
Yes. Amen. That's right.
So I'm going to grant that there was something true he was trying to get at there.
Right.
But the way it ended up being framed was, you could have no way of assessing in the end whether this led to human flourishing or not.
That's right.
All you could have was, hey, some people have predilections that aren't yours, get over it. And here's how they can engage in them without hurting people too much.
Right.
And so get over yourself. And it was and so so Chris Williamson keeps pushing him.
To Chris Williams' credit, he kept pushing him on it. I mean, repeatedly throughout the episode. It was really great.
But got nothing really satisfying.
No, he didn't.
And as I'm watching it, I'm thinking, I know more about this than this guy.
Yeah.
And but I've read a few books relatedly. And so two in particular that I found very helpful were Esther Perel's The State of Affairs, mm-hmm. which, I'm not going to agree with every conclusion, But if you want to understand what's going on in people's minds and relationships around affairs and extramarital stuff, it's fascinating. I mean, completely fascinating. And one of the key insights from there is that people it's a natural and healthy thing that can be done well to take erotic energy from elsewhere and channel it into a healthy relationship.
Right.
So just if that sounds weird, like, no, you should never be able to do that. If you or your wife has ever like used an accent as a fun, like fantasy play, you're just taking erotic energy from outside and putting, right. It's like, there are healthy ways to do this. Okay. Right.
Let's talk about we talk about that certainly in another episode, because my only concern with that was if it becomes too much again. And this is where you're saying, like, if we're not thinking about our spouse as a spouse, as she is, and wanting to do too much fantasy play where it's dressing up like something else or some character or something, then you're not really bringing about a intimacy in the sense that we're thinking about her as she is. But I do agree with the point nonetheless about there is something to be said about novelty. There is something to be said about changing things up a little bit. What that looks like and parameters for that, of course, is a whole nother conversation that we can have. Yeah.
But my point was it allowed me to understand something about what people are at least attempting.
Right.
And this researcher was not interested in that.
No, he wasn't.
So what are they trying to achieve? I think there was something from Esther Perel. And then the other thing that was really insightful for me is Jay Stringer, who's a Christian counselor, an evangelical who works with people on pornography addiction. And the big insight from him was that people aren't attracted to porn in general. They're attracted to specific things, and the specific thing that they're attracted to is a clue. And this is where the non-judgmental thing comes in, right? It's a clue to the need that they're trying to satisfy.
Right.
What kind of thing, right? And so you could go through a list of different kinds of things that people might find attractive and then do an analysis. Like, what are you looking for in that, right? And the fascinating thing about this discussion, which is connected with the whole thing we just talked about, is it seems to me that virtually all of this increase in cuckolding is downstream from porn.
Yeah, well, there's no doubt about it.
I'd bet my last dollar. Yeah. And what are people doing when they're pursuing
and widespread birth control? Let's just put it all
right.
there. Yeah.
There's something about their sense of masculinity that they can't make sense of or understand.
Right.
Probably because the culture has shamed them for being men, but that's not working out great in the bedroom. And so what you do instead is find this sort of hyper masculine other to sort of like,
you work with the tools that are given to you. And so if all you're given is the tools of, well, this is what we're supposed to do, then you stay within that lane. And so I know you have to leave here in a couple of minutes. So I want to make this point just to button up at least as part of the conversation. And I'm more than happy for us to continue talking about all this. Where that researcher falls short, of course, is that he's not a philosopher. And his philosophical presuppositions of the person are well off. And this is why science, as much as I use it and incorporate it, of course, into my domain as a practitioner, has its limitations. And if science is strict observation of the data of whatever it is, when it comes to studying the person, we're not just studying rocks. The way we interpret behavior and actions and movement and who the person is requires something else that's a little bit more foundational. So we need to have a proper philosophical understanding of the person, or at least something that's there that allows us to be able to say, I know what I'm looking at. And I know what I'm looking at. And then when I know what I'm looking at, then we can start determining what is appropriate and what isn't. And so his philosophical, presuppositions are well different than ours, which allows him to look at the data. Which allows him to look at the data differently and interpret the data differently than the way that you and I would interpret it. Yeah.
And I'm guessing he couldn't even articulate his philosophical presuppositions. No. He seemed completely innocent of the possibility. He was just like taking this for granted. Yeah. And so to your point, so then he says, and this is the lengthy email I wrote you. Then he says, porn is just a way to manage difference in sexual desire. Mm-hmm. And what we've learned in our marriage that I wish, for so many people is like difference in sexual desire is an opportunity.
Yes. Yeah.
And if you take his advice and just say, well, the way to sort of mediate between those differences is for one of you to have a side gig.
Right.
Then your opportunity is gone, right? And the person with lower desire, typically this is the woman, but by no means in every case.
Correct. And I've counseled many couples where it's not the case.
Where it's not the case, right? No matter who it is, there is a kind of reaching out to something in them that they need from their partner, that if their partner is satisfying themselves in other ways, they will never do it.
Right.
And there is something waiting inside of someone else to be brought alive that you could just leave there.
Right.
For the rest of your life and spend your time in, I don't know what, in front of your computer or in clubs or wherever you're doing your thing.
That's right.
And I wish people could understand that, like, this is a really key difference. But it applies to all of them. Like, the differences that you're encountering in your marriage are not a problem to be managed.
Yes.
They're an opportunity to know and be known by another person. And like, this is what I wrote to you, like, everybody loves orgasms, like 3 cheers for orgasms. But given the choice between an orgasm and being known and understood by another person, you will take option B every single time.
Absolutely.
And that's what rattles me so much about
of course,
his prescription.
Because we can articulate where he's coming from more than he is, and man, that sounds so arrogant. I'm really sorry. I'm not trying to say it that way. My understanding of the disposition he's coming from what the world the common kind of cultural refrain when it comes to sex is that the basic, we can kind of play lip service to intimacy or play lip service to procreation, but really what this is about pleasure. And so we've reduced sex to its most carnal kind of lowest common denominator, which is just strict pleasure. And so if it's just about pleasure, well then however you get that pleasure is the most ethical thing. It's the most moral thing, because we've set that as the value. We've set that as the standard. And so everything else kind of falls subject to that as being the standard, to which we would say, but is it? And does that really lead to human flourishing, like you said? And if it is just that, well, what about all this other stuff that comes with it too? Bonding, kids, intimacy, all this. We can't just set all that stuff aside. How about we bring all that into us? And now let's have a full, well-rounded conversation where what if we could have orgasm and pleasure in the context of being seen and being known? Whoa, now we've changed the argument. We've changed the language here. And that's the beauty of the vision that we're trying to communicate.
Yeah. A last point, because it circles back to something we said earlier that we kind of left hanging, and it could be a whole episode, but a last point, that a difference that we've learned about one another as men and women in the bedroom is pleasure means a different thing depending on what your bonding mechanism is. Right. If pleasure is if bonding is being heard and understood and connected for women, and for men it's achieving a common goal, then men need to understand that pleasure in sex means closeness and intimacy and bonding. In that, I shouldn't say just intimacy, because it means intimacy for men too, but in a different way. For men, it means like we did something together. We're like, look at us, how we managed to get good at this thing, and we do it, and we're just recognizing that basic difference. Yes. That the way sex bonds men and the way sex bonds women is gender specific. Yes. Made sense of a ton of things that we would never make sense of if it was like, well, you need orgasms twice a week and I need them 4 times a week. That's right. So, but here's the point, right? Here's where the gift is in all this. You're absolutely right. So even with, like for men, with orgasm, it does activate that sense of accomplishment. That sense of we've achieved something here. Like I've gotten something. And that's why even that type of language is used in kind of the common vernacular. But what ends up happening after that for a guy? He falls asleep. Right? And this is where it's beautiful. This is where it all kind of comes together beautifully, is the sense that women end up getting really upset about that. But what happens? The guy finally has a place to rest. Right? He's home. And safe. He's home and safe. Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, gosh. Okay, I have another meeting.
I know you do. All right. So, Brett, let's get part 2 on the books. And yeah, this has been fantastic, man. So
Awesome.
thanks for making it happen. Okay.
Great to talk to you again.
Alrighty. All right, everybody. Well, that does it for my conversation with Dr. Brett Salkeld. So grateful for his knowledge and his expertise and just his invitation to want to have this conversation. This discussion is, this episode rather, is going to be on both my podcast and on his podcast. And so if you're interested in the things that he's talking about, then please check out his Thinking Faith podcast. I'll have a link to that in the show notes. And I think you're going to love the conversations that he has on that show as well. Brett just has a wonderful mind and is very clear in his thoughts and very balanced and nuanced as well. And I just appreciate that, especially coming in the Catholic space. So grateful. All right. Well, that does it for today's episode. God bless everybody. Have a great day. And don't forget to leave a rating or write a review on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. All right. See you later.